close your eyes for a moment and imagine that every belief you've ever had about yourself was written by someone you can no longer remember. Would you still defend those beliefs? Or would you question them for the first time? Most people never ask themselves that. They introduce themselves with names, careers, achievements, failures, personalities, and habits, believing those things explain who they are, but they don't. They only explain the story they've repeated often enough to believe. Every human being lives inside two worlds. The first is the one everyone can see, the conversations, the routines, the responsibilities, the goals, the version of you that wakes up, answers messages, solves problems, smiles at the right moments, and continues moving because that's what life expects. Then there's the second world, the invisible one, the place where every decision is made long before anyone notices it, where fear quietly changes your direction without introducing itself, where hope survives even after. Disappointment insists it shouldn't, where memories don't disappear. They simply change the meaning of everything that comes after them. That invisible world decides far more about your life than the visible one ever will. Yet most people spend their entire lives decorating the outside while the inside quietly writes the ending. Think about the last decision you made. Maybe it seemed logical. Maybe you even had good reasons. But if someone could pause time and ask your mind one impossible question, what created the person who made this choice? Would you actually know the answer? Or would you simply explain the choice itself? There's a difference. A choice is visible. Its origin rarely is. We're taught to fix actions. Wake up earlier, work harder, become more disciplined, be more confident, speak more clearly, think positively. Advice like this isn't wrong. It's just incomplete. Because actions grow from identity, and identity grows from stories. Chant the story, and behavior begins changing without force. Genos, the story, and every improvement becomes another exhausting performance. That's why so many people feel tired without understanding why. They're trying to create a new life using an old definition of themselves. It's like planting a different seed while refusing to change the soil. Nothing truly changes. Only appearances do. I've started noticing something strange about the human mind. It protects familiarity more fiercely than happiness. If given the choice between a painful certainty and an unfamiliar possibility, most people choose the pain, not because they enjoy suffering, because suffering they understand feels safer than freedom they don't. That's one of the greatest paradoxes of being human. We say we want change, but our habits quietly vote for repetition. Not once, every single day, morning routines, thought patterns, emotional reactions, private conversations with ourselves. They become invisible because we've repeated them so many times. Then one day, we wonder why our future looks so similar to our past. The answer was never hidden. It was simply disguised as normal. Normal is powerful, not because it's correct, because it's unquestioned. Question something long enough, and eventually you'll discover whether it's true or merely familiar. That realization transformed the way I look at almost everything. Instead of asking whether something was right, I started asking where it came from. A belief, a fear, a dream, a limitation. Who placed it there? Experience, family, failure, success? Or was it simply borrowed from people who were equally uncertain? It's astonishing how much of our identity arrives through imitation. We copy ways of speaking, ways of thinking, ways of reacting, until eventually we forget which parts were learned. and which parts were always ours. Maybe that's why silence feels so uncomfortable. Silence removes distractions. Without constant noise, borrowed thoughts begin separating from authentic ones. At first, the difference is almost impossible to notice. Then, suddenly, it becomes impossible to ignore. You realize you've been answering questions nobody asked, chasing goals you never chose, protecting opinions that no longer belong to the person you're becoming. That realization isn't depressing. It's liberating, because what can be questioned can also be rewritten. Not your past, your relationship with it. People often believe healing means forgetting. I don't think that's true. Forgetting changes memory, understanding changes meaning, meaning changes identity, and identity quietly changes everything else. Imagine carrying the same memory with a completely different understanding. The event hasn't changed, but your future has. That's the hidden power of perspective, not to erase reality, but to reveal possibilities that reality contained all along. Life rarely traps us. Interpretation does. The mind is an extraordinary storyteller. Give it one painful experience, and it might build an entire identity around avoiding anything similar. Not because danger everywhere, because memory mistakes probability for certainty. One disappointment becomes people always leave. One failure becomes I'm not capable. One rejection becomes I was never enough. Notice what happens. An event becomes a conclusion. The conclusion becomes a belief. The belief becomes a personality. Years later, you call it who you are, when in reality, it was only a sentence your mind never stopped repeating. Perhaps freedom begins much earlier than people imagine. Not when circumstances improve, not when opportunities appear, but the exact moment you become aware that every inner sentence can be questioned. That awareness changes everything. Not immediately. Quietly, like sunrise, darkness doesn't disappear because someone pushes it away. It disappears because light gradually makes it impossible to remain. Awareness works the same way. It doesn't fight illusion. It simply makes illusion visible. Once you've seen it, you can never completely believe it again. That may be the greatest gift consciousness offers. Not perfect answers, better questions. Questions powerful enough to loosen the grip of identities that no longer deserve your loyalty. Because perhaps the most important discovery you'll ever make isn't hidden somewhere in the future. Perhaps it's waiting inside a single realization. The realization that you've spent years trying to improve a version of yourself that was never meant to be permanent, and maybe, just maybe, the person you've been searching for isn't someone you have to become at all. It's the one that's been patiently waiting beneath every expectation, every fear, every borrowed belief, and every story you've mistaken for your own. The day you finally meet that person, nothing outside may look different. The same sky will stretch above you. The same roads will lead home. The same people will speak your name, but inside, a quiet revolution will already have begun. And once that revolution starts, you'll never again confuse the life you've inherited with the life you're capable of creating. There comes a moment in every life that rarely receives any attention. It isn't celebrated. It isn't announced. No one around you notices it, yet it quietly divides your life into two different chapters. The first chapter is lived through reaction. The second begins with intention. Most people spend years believing they are making choices, when in reality, they are repeating patterns that were created long before they understood they had them. Think about how many opinions you have never examined, how many fears you've accepted without asking where they came from, how many limits you've carried simply because they became familiar. Repetition has an unusual power. Anything repeated often enough begins to feel true. Not because it is, because the mind mistakes familiarity for certainty. That's why change feels uncomfortable. You're not only changing behavior, you're challenging everything your mind has learned to call normal. Normal has never been the same thing as healthy. Neither has comfortable. Some of the most destructive habits in the world become invisible simply because they've existed for too long. People stop questioning them. They stop noticing them. Eventually, they stop believing another way is even possible. That is how invisible prisons are built, not with walls, with assumptions. The strange thing about assumptions is that they rarely sound dramatic. They sound reasonable. They whisper instead of shout. They tell you to wait a little longer, to stay where things are predictable, to avoid disappointment by avoiding possibility. Little by little, they convince you that safety and stagnation are the same thing, but they aren't. Safety allows you to grow. Stagnation convinces you that growth is dangerous. There's an important difference. One protects your future. The other quietly steals it. I used to think confidence meant never questioning yourself. Now I see confidence differently. Real confidence is the willingness to question yourself without falling apart. Anyone can protect an opinion. It takes maturity to replace one, because replacing an old belief feels strangely personal. It can seem as though you're losing a part of yourself. In reality, you're only losing the version that has already finished teaching you what it came to teach. Growth isn't betrayal. Growth is gratitude expressed through movement. Every season of your life serves a purpose, but no season is meant to last forever. Winter cannot become spring by refusing to let go of the cold. The same is true for us. We cannot become someone new while insisting on carrying every old definition into the future. There are moments when life gently asks us to put something down, not because it has no value, because we've already received everything it had to offer. Sometimes it's an old fear, sometimes it's an outdated dream, sometimes it's an identity that once protected us but now quietly limits us. Holding on feels responsible, letting go feels uncertain. Yet almost every meaningful transformation begins with release before it begins with gain. Nature understands this. Trees release leaves they spent an entire season growing. Rivers never hold on to the water that gave them shape. Even the sky changes every hour without apologizing for becoming something different. Only human beings believe they must remain exactly as once were in order to be authentic. Perhaps authenticity has never meant remaining the same. Perhaps it means remaining honest enough to evolve. That thought stayed with me for a long time, not because it answered every question, because it created better ones. If I stopped defining myself by my past, who would I become? If I stopped protecting an image of myself, what possibilities would finally have room to exist? If I no longer feared being misunderstood, would I still hide parts of myself from the world? Questions like these don't demand immediate answers. They demand attention, patient attention, the kind that changes the observer before it changes the conclusion. I believe we underestimate the power of quiet reflection, not because reflection gives us new information, because it allows old information to arrange itself differently. Sometimes the facts never change. Only the pattern becomes visible. And once you see the pattern, everything begins making sense in ways it never did before. You stop blaming every circumstance. You stop expecting every person to complete something inside you. You stop believing happiness is hiding somewhere outside your own awareness. Instead, you begin noticing something remarkable. Peace isn't created by controlling life. It's created by changing your relationship with it. Storms still come. Disappointments still arrive. Uncertainty still exists. But they no longer define the landscape of your mind. They become visitors instead of permanent residents. That is a different kind of freedom. Not freedom from difficulty. Freedom from becoming everything that happens to you. Because your experiences deserve respect. They do not deserve complete authority over your identity. You are always more than the hardest chapter you've survived. Always weighs more than the greatest mistake you've made. Always more than the labels you've accepted without question. The moment you begin believing that life quietly opens doors that fear convinced you never existed, not because the doors suddenly appeared, because your eyes finally became willing to look in a different direction, maybe that's what awakening really is. Not discovering a new world, discovering a new way of seeing the one that has always been in front of you. And once your vision changes, the path beneath your feet begins changing with it. Not because destiny has rewritten your future, because awareness has rewritten the person walking toward it. Every life is shaped by a collection of invisible decisions. Not the obvious ones, not the cities you lived in, the jobs you accepted, or the people you met, the quieter decisions, the ones you made without realizing you were making them. The day you decided your voice wasn't worth hearing, the moment you convinced yourself that failure meant you weren't capable. The instant you chose certainty over curiosity because it felt safer. Those decisions don't disappear, they become filters. And every experience that follows passes through them. That's why two people can witness the same event and leave with completely different truths. Reality speaks only once. The mind translates it in thousands of different ways. For a long time, I believed that changing my life meant changing my circumstances. A different environment, a different routine, a different opportunity. Those things matter. But they rarely solve the problem we expect them to solve, because wherever you go, your way of seeing follows you. A new chapter cannot feel new if you're reading it with the same expectations that wrote the last one. That realization taught me something simple. The quality of your attention determines the quality of your experience. What you constantly notice begins to define the world you believe you live in. If you search only for proof that life is unfair, your mind will become exceptionally skilled at finding it. If you search only for danger, every unfamiliar moment will appear threatening. Attention is like water. Whatever it touches begins to grow. That is why protecting your attention may be one of the most important responsibilities you'll ever have. Not everything deserves to live in your mind. Not every opinion deserves your energy. Not every fear deserves another conversation. Some thoughts become stronger, simply because we continue feeding them. Others disappear the moment we stop treating them as permanent truths. I've started asking myself a different question whenever a difficult thought appears. Instead of asking, "Is this true?" I ask, "Is this useful?" The answer is often surprising. Many thoughts are neither true nor false. They're habits, old echoes repeating themselves because they've never been interrupted. Interrupting them doesn't require force. It requires awareness. The moment you notice a pattern, you create distance from it, and in that distance, something extraordinary becomes possible. Choice, not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the choice to respond differently. To pause before repeating yesterday, to allow a new possibility to exist, even if only for a moment. Every meaningful transformation begins there, not with certainty, with a pause. A single moment where the past no longer controls the next step automatically. Most people underestimate how powerful one different decision can become. Not because it changes everything overnight, because it changes the direction. And direction, given enough time, changes destiny. You don't become another person in one day. You become another person through thousands of moments where you refuse to abandon the version of yourself you're growing into. There will always be reasons to return to old patterns. They're familiar, predictable, comforting, but familiarity isn't proof that something belongs in your future. Sometimes it's only evidence that you've carried it for a long time. Future isn't built by repeating what feels easiest. It's built by choosing what remains meaningful long after the moment has passed. Perhaps that's the quiet purpose of awareness. Not to make life perfect, but to make life intentional. Because an intentional life isn't measured by how loudly it's lived. It's measured by how honestly it's chosen. And maybe that's where real freedom begins. Not when every obstacle disappears, but when you finally realize that your greatest power has never been controlling the world around you. It has always been deciding who you become while moving through it. That decision is renewed every day, every conversation, every challenge, every ordinary morning that offers another chance to become just a little more awake than you were the day before. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that has always been enough. Not to become someone else, but to become someone you recognize with quiet confidence whenever you meet yourself in the silence.